Hello, my name is Peter Pomerantsev. I'm a scholar, I suppose, at University of Johnse Hopkinse, but also I'm an author, most recently of This Is Not Propaganda, a book that is available in the Czech language as well. And I wish I could be there with you. This is such an important event. You have amazing guests. And also Prague is a huge part of my life. My parents live in Prague. I spent several years living in Prague after university. And so in a way, I feel that, you know, I'm an honorary citizen, and I hope to meet all of you in person, if not this time, then next time. I've been asked to talk about the future of this war, the future of Ukraine, the future of Russia. And my first answer is the future is in our hands. You know, this is really a war that has shown that pressure from below, pressure from society, pressure from civil society has managed to ensure that you know, the great powers of the world have remained interested in this war, have remained helping Ukraine. And so each one of us has a role to play. This is not a war that's dictated from on high. This is a war that starts with the energy and the desire and the focus of the Ukrainian people to make their case to the world and to enlist support, and the reaction that causes in everyone. And when politicians see how deeply the Ukrainian cause resonates, they act because they understand its importance. So this war will be decided by us in many ways, by all of you. But I do think there is at least three main vectors that we need to consider. And I'm actually not going to talk about the most obvious one, which I will leave to others at this conference. I'm not going to talk about security and weapons, simply because I'm not an expert on that. And there are many others at this conference, like President Pavel, of course, who are experts. So I'll let them talk about that. It's clearly Ukraine has to join the European and transatlantic security community. Precisely what form that takes, I will leave to the people who are the great diplomats and experts on it. It's just obvious that it needs to. But I want to focus on things that I do understand because I work on them. Accountability, yeah. So justice, the global perception around this war, which is a key part of the victory. And finally, and perhaps most complicatedly, to make up a word, what can we do about changes inside Russia, if anything? Yeah? What role do we have to play, if any? So let's start with this idea of justice and how that's going to be playing out over the next year and why it's so important. Russia's great challenge to the world is that in the 21st century, impunity will rule. Yeah? Putin's pseudo-philosophy is that might is right, and that he can murder with impunity. What's so striking about the Russian war crimes in Ukraine is actually how little the Kremlin covers them up. It kind of does them openly and says, what are you going to do about it? We're big, we're strong, we have oil, we have money, you can't touch us. And that's a very powerful statement. Yeah, we have huge amount of evidence of exposure of war crimes, of crimes against humanity, most likely of genocide. And yet this gap between truth and justice seems to be getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And everywhere I hear, as I work on issues to do with accountability, is like, so what? So what? You'll find Putin guilty of war crimes. So what? You'll never get him. He's too big, he's too strong. Now, historically, Ukraine has played a very pivotal place in our understanding of justice. I'd like to take us back a little bit to the 1930s, when two lawyers from the territory of today's Ukraine, from the town of Lviv, Raphael Lemkin and Lauterpacht, seeing the devastation going on around themselves during partly the Holodomor, Stalin's enforced famine of Ukraine, realized that our forms of international justice are lacking. Later, when so much of the Holocaust plays out in the territory of today's Ukraine, they go on to develop their theories further, and they come up with the language to define evil and to hold evil accountable. The idea of genocide and the idea of crimes against humanity. Now, I don't think it's accidental there from today's Ukraine. Because Ukraine is positioned in such proximity and in many ways as it's so much part of the European story and European institutions, an integral part of it, but at the same time has always been so vulnerable to the violence caused by different empires, but most of all the Soviet Empire, the Nazi attempt to build an empire, the Russian Empire before that. Because it's in this place between barbarity and meaning, it can be the place where we start to make sense of horror. It's the place where all our minds start going, okay, how do we make sense of what is going on and how do we hold it to account? That might be part of the destiny of Ukraine, and certainly is its historic destiny. It's not accidental that our concepts of genocide and crimes against humanity were formulated by people from today's Ukraine. And I think we'll see that in this war. Not only will I think we'll see the old ideas of accountability being used, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, I think we'll see new ones. Because what Russia is doing goes beyond those categories. I'm speaking now a few days after Russia's explosion of the Kakhovka Dam. People are describing it as an ecocide. That's not a legal term, but it needs to become one. What Russia is doing when it takes Ukrainian children and then indoctrinates them in Crimea, in Donbass, in the occupied territories, to hate Ukraine, and then sends them as soldiers to fight against Ukraine, is firstly illegal, but it's also a crime against freedom of thought. That's what the Chinese are trying to do with the Uyghurs. Again, this is not something that has ever been used in legal practice, but I think we will do that. And when we think about justice, I think we have to think about it in a much broader way than we have previously. So I work on something called the Reckoning Project, an NGO that I created with my colleagues Janine Di Giovanni and Natalia Kumenyuk in the aftermath of the full-scale invasion. And our idea is to think about accountability, not just a trial in The Hague, the sort of magical belief we have in The Hague. We think about it all the way from the court of public opinion, the court of sanctions, the court of public pressure. And when we think about trials, we're thinking about universal jurisdiction in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia, as well as, of course, The Hague. A web of accountability, both in the public sphere, in the economic sphere, and in the classic sphere of courts. I very much like that idea that's been put forward by British lawyers to create an economic tribunal for Ukraine. So people who have suffered from the war will be compensated through a system of courts and tribunals with assets seized from the Russian states, and I think from sanctions against companies that keep on doing business with Russia. So there are all these ways we can think about justice, and there's all these new charges that we have to lay at Russia's door. At the moment, we're still very far away from it. At the moment, a few companies left Russia, most stayed, especially German ones. There is still a level of impunity about doing business with Russia and about making money from it. And often the sanctions are treated as a sort of joke. So the more we bring the charges, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ecocide, freedom of thought, all these charges, the more we expand the amount of people who are found guilty, not just Putin, but the whole system that makes this happen, the more that we then enact all forms of justice against them, the more the system will be squeezed and squeezed and squeezed, and the more we set a precedent, and this is key, for other countries and places. Now, one of the accountability issues that I'm most interested in, because I focus on propaganda, is can we hold Russian propagandists accountable for their aiding and abetting war crimes, for their incitement to genocide? Usually propagandists get away with it. Historically, there's only been a couple of cases where propagandists were found guilty. But we live in a world today where we can track how information campaigns are integrated into war crimes. So the hours before and after an attack, a Russian attack on a hospital, you'll see thousands of Russian online accounts saying, oh, the hospital was full of Nazis, or the Ukrainians bombed themselves. And you see the same message repeated by spokespeople. We can track that online through content analysis, much easier than we could before. And we can show the extent to which this is clearly coordinated and organized. So I believe that one of the things that we'll see going forward is a legal pushback and legal accountability for Russia's propaganda machine. Now, this brings me to my second point that I want to talk about, where I think the crucial battle will be over the next year and where we have a role to play, and that is in the information space. Because however, legal means against even the most malign information operations will never in democracies be able to stop, or should they ever fully stop, Russian communication. They will keep on pushing out their lies and their disinformation to Europe, but very importantly to the global south, to Africa, to Latin America, to the Middle East, where Russian media remains at times hegemonic, but always a very major player and operating with complete license. Now, while legal mechanisms will be one way to undermine the system, they can't and they shouldn't ever be the only way. In democracies, at the end of the day, for very good reasons, any kind of legal mechanisms will be limited to the most egregious types of genocidal propaganda. So the question is, how do we compete? How can we reach audiences in the parts of Europe that are still pro-Russian, and sadly there are these communities in every European country, and in some European countries the attitudes remain very pro-Russian, and then beyond that. Now, this is very important because Putin can still win this war in the eyes of global perception. He can still say, hey, I went on a war, but I survived. I survived. You're still all doing business with me. And I got away with it. Even if I didn't get to capture the whole of Ukraine, I got my 10%, I kept Crimea, had a bit of fun. And at the end of the day, it's all the West's fault, which is an attitude which is still dominant everywhere. Putin is still often perceived as someone, a small guy, taking on the big guys. And the small guy's allowed to lose. The main thing is, he took them on. Look how brave he is, fearless. Yes, he made some mistakes, but what guts he has. Now, that attitude is still very, very prevalent. The idea that this war is the West's fault, that Russia is just defending itself desperately, the poor little Russia defending itself by causing genocide in Ukraine, is still a story that's quite successful throughout the world. So how can we compete? How can we start reaching these audiences? Because frankly, we do not compete at all at present. China, Russia invest huge amounts of resources into their international information operations. We have some woolly idea about supporting tiny little media in, I don't know, in the global south. This will not compete. We need to develop our own, what I call a democratic communications infrastructure, which can't be anything like theirs. We know how theirs works, a mixture of troll farms, diplomats who use threats and bribes, TV channels that push conspiracy theories. We know what information war architecture they use. Ours can be nothing like that. Ours has to differ in philosophy, and to put it very simply, ours always has to be about activating people's curiosity, activating their potential as democratic actors, as subjects. If the Russians use troll farms, we should use online town halls. So our philosophy of communication has to be completely different. But it also has to understand people's biases, their emotions, their prejudices. We have to know how to reach people, to put audiences first, not to lecture down to them. So we are in a kind of a kind of psychographic arms race with Russia and China and Iran and extremists to understand audiences and find a way of communicating with them. You don't have to do that in a way that is underhand and manipulative. You can do that in a way that's very open and very welcoming and very democratic, but you have to do it. Currently, we do not. That needs to change. I very much welcome an initiative which has been nicknamed Information Ramstein, introduced by the Ukrainians and taken up now, slowly being taken up by Western partners, where we put together our information capacities, a little bit like we have with the weapons, where the main democracies, the most important communicators, work together in order to counter the threats posed by Russian disinformation and authoritarian information war throughout the world. If we work together, we can be more than the sum of our parts. We've proved that with the weapons. We should be doing the same in the information space. But the biggest information challenge of all, of course, is into Russia. And here we are in a moment of pause, a moment of hesitancy, for many reasons. Historically, democracies have always done public information campaigns, media, cultural activity into the heart of the enemy. We did it in Germany in the Second World War. We did it with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. We haven't started to do that with Russia, largely because we still haven't admitted to ourselves in the West that Russia is a long-term problem. We're still treating this just as Ukraine's problem. So let's help Ukraine a little bit. It's not. Russia is our problem too. Russia wants to destroy the fragile, pitiful, but deeply valuable, minimal adherence to democratic values that has been managed to be created since the Second World War and the end of the Cold War. I don't want to over-glamorize it. It's tiny, but it's something. They want to destroy that. They want to discredit the West. They want to divide and conquer us. At the moment, we still haven't officially said that we're in a state of political war with Russia. Yeah. We are in political warfare with Russia. That's not something we've officially said and have admitted. Firstly, we have to admit that. Secondly, we have to understand that there are very limited things we can do in communicating with Russian audiences, but they're very important. All we're really talking about now is changing perceptions in Russia so that it shifts the calculation of the elites to get them to change their foreign policy. This is not about regime change, which is an idiotic idea, and the idea that you could change the regime in Russia is stupid, frankly. This is not about, the decomposition of Russia, all these esoteric debates that we have. We don't know that future. We have a very, very precise aim over the next 3 to 5 years, which is changing perceptions in Russia so that they change their foreign policy. Yeah? The same way that we had to, after, Vietnam or pulling out of Afghanistan or many other cases. Or like the Soviet Union did when it pulled out of Afghanistan. That's what we have to get to. Now that's possible. This is not about finding good Russians. This is not about promoting democracy in Russia. Somebody else can do that. That's very important. It's a long-term project. That's not our mission right now. It does mean understanding Russian audiences. It means taking the 3 policies we have towards Russia: diplomatic isolation, economic sanctions, and military support to Ukraine, and ensuring that there is a public information component that communicates them forcefully to the Russian people. Forcefully, I mean in a way that's powerful and resonant. At the moment, we have a very weird situation. We help arm the Ukrainians, but then those defeats that the Ukrainians inflict on Russia are not communicated to the Russian people. They find out about them, but then they should be communicated relentlessly, non-stop, to show your leadership does not know what it's doing. At the moment, that's not happening. People in the rest of Russia barely heard about the incursion into Belgorod. And when they heard about it only from Putin. Nobody's doing that well. When we impose diplomatic isolation on Russia, which is quite correct, sports isolation, we then let Putin explain this to the Russians, strengthening his own position. When we enforce sanctions, we let Putin explain the sanctions to the Russians, allowing him to spin it to his own benefit. That can't go on. Yeah? We have to be following up our policies in the economic, political, and military space with information, or else they won't work properly. Imagine you were to do an economic reform policy in the Czech Republic and not followed up with a public information campaign. Could you imagine that? And let the opposition own the narrative. Insane. But that is what we're doing. That is the next step that has to be taken. In terms of how you do it, let's make that the focus maybe of your conversations, of a future conference. But compared to the Cold War, where all we had was shortwave radio, the opportunities to communicate to Russians are vast. The vulnerabilities and cognitive openings are there if you look for them. We just have to have the will and the desire to do so. And I hope your conference will be part of elaborating the vision to achieve just that.